The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped, cold holding cell. John Carter sat on a hard metal bench, his hands cuffed and his head bowed low. The air smelled faintly of rust and despair, a fitting backdrop for the life he'd come to know. At 42, John had seen more than most people could imagine, both the best and worst of humanity. Once celebrated as a decorated Marine who served 2 grueling tours in Afghanistan, he now found himself locked behind bars, accused of stealing food from a grocery store. It wasn't supposed to end like this. When John enlisted at 19, full of patriotism and purpose, he dreamed of making a difference. He fought bravely alongside his brothers in arms, earning medals for valor under fire. But war leaves scars deeper than any bullet wound. After returning home, John struggled to adjust to civilian life. Nightmares haunted him nightly, replaying scenes of chaos and loss that no amount of therapy seemed to erase. Civilians didn't understand what he'd been through. They couldn't relate to the weight of decisions made in split seconds or the faces of fallen comrades etched into his memory. His marriage crumbled under the strain, followed by his job when he couldn't keep up with the demands of everyday life. Without family nearby and too proud to ask for help, John eventually ended up on the streets. For months, he wandered aimlessly, relying on scraps from dumpsters and the occasional kindness of strangers. It was a bitter irony. A man who once carried wounded soldiers to safety now couldn't even afford a meal. That fateful night, hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. His stomach felt hollow, and his body trembled not just from the biting winter chill, but also from exhaustion. Desperation drove him into the grocery store, where shelves were stocked with fresh bread, fruits, and warm meals. He grabbed a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a carton of milk, enough to quiet the ache in his belly for a few days. But before he could leave, an alarm blared, and security guards surrounded him. Shame washed over John as he dropped the items and raised his hands. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I haven't eaten in days." The guards weren't interested in explanations. They called the police, and within minutes, John was shoved into the back of a squad car, his dignity crumbling further with each passing second. Now, sitting in a holding cell, John stared at the cracked tiles beneath his feet. Each one seemed to mirror the fractures in his own life. He wondered if anyone would believe him when he said he never wanted to hurt anyone. He only wanted to survive. Memories of happier times flickered in his mind. The camaraderie of his unit, the pride of wearing his uniform, the cheers of loved ones during homecomings. Those days felt like another lifetime ago, almost as though they belonged to someone else entirely. As he waited to be brought before the judge, John clutched the old military cap he still carried everywhere. Its fabric was worn thin, its edges frayed, but it was one of the last tangible connections to the man he used to be. He didn't expect leniency. After all, laws were laws. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small part of him hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone might see past the scruffy beard and tattered clothes and recognize the soldier he once was. Little did he know, fate had something extraordinary waiting for him in that courtroom. The courtroom was quiet, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional cough from the gallery. Judge Margaret Hayes entered with her usual air of authority, her black robes flowing behind her like a shadow. She took her seat at the bench, adjusting her glasses as she scanned the docket for the day's cases. To most people in the room, this was just another routine hearing, a minor theft case that would likely end with a slap on the wrist or a small fine. But something about John Carter's name caught her attention. "Jonathan Michael Carter," she read aloud, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The name felt familiar, like an echo from the past she couldn't quite place. She glanced down at the file again, skimming over the details. Homeless veteran, charged with shoplifting food. It was hardly the kind of case that usually stood out to her, yet there was something nagging at the edges of her memory, pulling her back to a time long before she wore the judge's robe. In the center of the courtroom, John stood awkwardly, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his circumstances. His tattered clothes hung loosely on his frame, and his hands fidgeted nervously with the brim of an old military cap. He looked out of place among the polished wood and formal attire of the court, like a relic from another world. No one seemed to notice the faded dog tags dangling around his neck, or the way his eyes darted around the room, searching for some sign of understanding or mercy. Judge Hayes cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone firm but not unkind, "you are here today because you allegedly stole food from a local grocery store. Is that correct?" John hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied softly, his voice barely audible. "And why did you take the items?" She pressed, leaning slightly forward. Her question wasn't accusatory. It carried a note of genuine interest, as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle. I haven't eaten in days," John admitted, his cheeks flushing with shame. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just needed something to eat." The honesty in his words struck a chord with Judge Hayes. She studied him carefully now, noticing the lines etched deeply into his face and the scars that marked his skin. There was a weariness about him, a heaviness that suggested years of struggle far beyond what most people endured. And then it hit her, the reason his name sounded so familiar. Her mind raced back nearly 2 decades to a phone call she'd received late one night. Her younger brother, Daniel, had been serving in Afghanistan when his unit came under heavy enemy fire. Against all odds, they survived thanks to the bravery of one man, Sergeant John Carter. Daniel had recounted the story countless times, describing how Carter had carried him to safety despite being injured himself. That act of courage had saved Daniel's life, and by extension, changed the course of Judge Hayes' own life forever. She blinked, bringing herself back to the present. Could this disheveled man standing before her really be the same soldier her brother had spoken of so reverently? She needed to know for sure. Taking a deep breath, she leaned further forward, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative, "are you related to Sergeant John Carter, who served in Afghanistan?" John froze, his fingers tightening around the brim of his cap. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if unsure whether he'd heard her correctly. Then, slowly, he nodded. "That's me, Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm Sergeant John Carter." The room fell silent. Even the bailiff stopped shuffling papers, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Judge Hayes sat back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. This wasn't just another petty crime case anymore. Somehow, fate had brought one of the men responsible for saving her family directly into her courtroom. And suddenly, everything felt different. Judge Hayes stared at John, her mind racing as the pieces fell into place. The name, the scars, the quiet dignity in his voice, it all added up to one undeniable truth. This wasn't just any homeless man standing before her. This was Sergeant John Carter, the same soldier whose bravery had saved her brother's life. She felt a lump rise in her throat, memories flooding back like a storm she couldn't contain. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, leaning forward on the bench, "do you remember a soldier named Daniel Hayes?" John's brow furrowed as he tried to recall the name. Then, slowly, recognition dawned in his eyes. "Daniel. Yeah, I remember him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was part of my unit during that ambush near Kandahar. We got pinned down by enemy fire, and—" His voice trailed off, but the weight of what he left unsaid hung heavy in the air. Judge Hayes nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "That's right," she confirmed, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "You carried him out of there when he was injured. You shielded him from gunfire, even though you were hurt yourself. My brother told me so many times how you saved his life, and not just his. You kept your entire team alive that day." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the exchange unfolded. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they should feel awe or sorrow, or both. For John, it was overwhelming. He hadn't thought about those days in years, not because he wanted to forget, but because remembering always brought the pain rushing back. The faces of fallen comrades, the deafening roar of explosions, the endless nights spent staring at the stars while wondering if he'd ever see home again. It all came crashing down on him now. "I didn't do anything special," John murmured, shaking his head. "I was just doing my job." But Judge Hayes wouldn't let him dismiss it so easily. "No, Mr. Carter," she said firmly, her voice rising just enough to command attention. "What you did was extraordinary. You put yourself in harm's way for others. Not once, but countless times. And yet here you are today, accused of stealing food because you haven't eaten in days." Her words carried a mixture of disbelief and sadness, as though she couldn't reconcile the hero in front of her with the circumstances that had led him to this moment. Then, without warning, Judge Hayes stood up from her bench. The sudden movement startled everyone in the room. With deliberate steps, she walked closer to where John stood, her gaze fixed on him. "Take off your cap, Mr. Carter," she instructed gently. Confused but compliant, John removed the worn military cap from his head. As he did, the courtroom gasped audibly. Scars crisscrossed his scalp and forehead, evidence of injuries sustained long ago, but never fully healed. Some looked surgical, others jagged and raw, as though they'd been stitched hastily under dire conditions. These weren't just marks of war. They were stories etched into his skin, silent testaments to sacrifices made in service of something greater than himself. Judge Hayes studied him intently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you know who this man is?" she asked, turning to address the packed courtroom. Her voice grew stronger, more impassioned. "This is Sergeant John Carter, a Marine who risked everything to protect his brothers in arms and innocent civilians alike. He fought for our freedom, for our safety, and for values we claim to hold dear. Yet here he stands, broken and forgotten, accused of taking food to survive." Her words reverberated through the room, stirring emotions among those present. Lawyers stopped scribbling notes, jurors exchanged glances, and spectators leaned forward in their seats, captivated. Even the bailiff seemed frozen in place, unsure how to process the gravity of the moment. For John, it was almost too much to bear. He lowered his head, fighting back tears as shame and gratitude warred within him. He hadn't expected anyone to care about who he used to be. Not anymore. But Judge Hayes wasn't done yet. She turned back to face him, her expression softening. "We owe you more than this, Mr. Carter," she said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "And I intend to make sure you get it." As she returned to her seat, the courtroom remained eerily silent, every eye glued to the man standing alone in the center of the room. For the first time in years, John felt seen, not as a criminal or a statistic, but as a human being worthy of respect. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a transformation that would change his life forever. The courtroom was still, the kind of silence that feels heavy and electric at the same time. Every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Judge Hayes sat back down behind her bench, her expression thoughtful but resolute. She glanced once more at John, who stood awkwardly in the center of the room, his cap now resting in his trembling hands. His scars were visible to everyone, raw reminders of battles fought long ago, battles most people could never fully understand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Hayes began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Before we proceed any further, I want each of you to take a moment and look at the man standing before us." Her words carried authority, commanding attention without raising her tone. Slowly, heads turned toward John, curiosity mingling with confusion. "This is Sergeant John Carter," she continued, gesturing toward him. "He served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine. He risked his life, not just once, but repeatedly, to protect others. During one particularly brutal firefight, he saved my brother's life by carrying him out of enemy fire while injured himself. That act alone should tell you everything you need to know about his character." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room remained silent, save for the faint rustle of fabric as some attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few jurors exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they looked at John with newfound respect. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the image of this broken man with the heroic soldier Judge Hayes described. "But let me remind you all of something else," she added, her voice growing firmer. "Sergeant Carter didn't fight those battles so someone like him could end up here, accused of stealing food because he hasn't eaten in days. He didn't endure pain and loss so that veterans like him could be abandoned when they came home. Yet here we are. Here he is. And it's not enough to call ourselves grateful for his service if we don't show it through our actions." Her words struck a nerve. People began to fidget uneasily, guilt settling over them like an invisible cloud. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet John's gaze. Others leaned forward, hanging on every word Judge Hayes spoke. It was as though she had peeled back a layer of indifference, forcing everyone in the room to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its heroes after the parades are over. Then, without warning, Judge Hayes did something unexpected. She rose from her seat again, this time turning to face the entire courtroom. With quiet determination, she said, "If anyone here believes that Sergeant Carter deserves even a fraction of the respect he earned through his service, then stand up now." For a split second, there was hesitation. No one moved. But then, slowly, a young woman in the front row stood up. She clasped her hands together tightly, her eyes locked on John, tears welling up in them. Behind her, an older man followed suit, rising to his feet. One by one, others joined in. Lawyers, jurors, court staff, spectators, all standing until the entire courtroom was on its feet. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and unflinching, rose silently, removing his hat in a gesture of reverence. John froze, overwhelmed by the sight before him. Tears streamed down his face as he looked around the room, seeing rows of people honoring him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. For so long, he'd felt invisible, forgotten, discarded by the very world he'd sworn to protect. Now, surrounded by strangers paying tribute to his sacrifice, he felt something stir deep within him, a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. Judge Hayes watched the scene unfold, her own emotions carefully masked beneath her professional demeanor. When the last person stood, she nodded solemnly. "Thank you," she said softly, addressing the crowd. Then, turning back to John, she added, "You may have thought no one remembered your name, Mr. Carter, but today this courtroom remembers. And tomorrow, we'll make sure the rest of the world does too." As the murmurs of approval rippled through the room, John wiped his face with trembling hands, clutching his cap tighter than ever. In that moment, he realized something profound. Maybe his story wasn't over yet. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for redemption, for rebuilding what had been lost. The courtroom remained standing, a sea of faces turned toward John, their respect palpable in the air. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. John stood there, his chest heaving with emotion, tears streaming down his face unchecked. He wasn't used to being seen this way, not anymore. The world had ignored him for so long that the weight of recognition now felt almost too much to bear. But it was Judge Hayes who broke the spell, her voice cutting through the silence like a beacon. "Mr. Carter," she said gently but firmly, "I am dismissing all charges against you today. Stealing food to survive is not a crime. It's a failure on our part as a society to ensure that no veteran ever has to go hungry again." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Then, turning to the bailiff, she instructed, "Please escort Mr. Carter to my chambers after this session concludes. I want to personally connect him with resources that can help." John nodded numbly, still overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. As the judge adjourned the hearing and people began filing out of the courtroom, several individuals approached him hesitantly. Some offered kind words. "Thank you for your service," or "We're sorry you had to go through this," while others simply shook his hand, their eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. A few even slipped small donations into his pocket before walking away, leaving him speechless. When the crowd finally thinned, Judge Hayes herself came over to speak with him. "Mr. Carter," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, "you've carried more than your share of burdens. It's time we lighten that load for you." She handed him a business card with the name and number of a local veterans support organization. "They'll take care of housing, medical care, counseling, anything you need. And if they don't," she gave him a pointed look, "you call me directly." John couldn't find the words to express how grateful he felt. Instead, he managed a shaky nod, clutching the card tightly in his hand as though it were a lifeline. For the first time in years, someone was offering him real help, not pity, but genuine support rooted in action. Word of what happened in the courtroom spread quickly beyond its walls. By late afternoon, news outlets picked up the story, dubbing it a moment of justice and redemption. Social media lit up with posts praising Judge Hayes' compassion and calling attention to the plight of homeless veterans nationwide. Within hours, offers of assistance poured in from every corner of the community. Local businesses reached out to provide temporary jobs. Shelters offered beds and meals. Church groups volunteered to collect clothing and toiletries. Even strangers from neighboring towns sent messages of encouragement, pledging financial contributions to help John get back on his feet. That evening, as John sat in a warm room at a nearby shelter, a place arranged for him by Judge Hayes herself, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The scars on his body might never fade, and the memories of war would always linger, but for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that life could be different. He thought about the people who had stood up for him in the courtroom, the ones who had donated money or supplies, and the judge who refused to let him slip through the cracks. They reminded him that humanity wasn't lost. It was just waiting to be awakened. As he lay down on the cot provided for him, staring at the ceiling, John whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Tomorrow wouldn't be easy. He knew that much, but tonight, he allowed himself to rest, knowing he wasn't alone anymore. The road ahead would require hard work, resilience, and trust in others, but for the first time in years, he was ready to take those steps. After all, he'd already faced far worse and survived. Months later, the small town buzzed with excitement as residents gathered in the park for an annual ceremony honoring local veterans. American flags fluttered in the crisp autumn breeze, and rows of folding chairs were set up beneath a large pavilion, decorated with red, white, and blue banners. The event had always drawn a respectable crowd, but this year felt different, bigger, more personal. People whispered to each other about John Carter, whose story had become a symbol of resilience and redemption. John stood nervously at the edge of the stage, adjusting his tie for what must have been the 10th time. He wore a suit donated by a local tailor, its fabric smooth and unfamiliar against his skin. His old military cap rested on a nearby table, cleaned and carefully preserved as a memento of where he'd come from. Beside him, Judge Hayes gave him an encouraging smile. "You've got this, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "Just speak from the heart." When it was finally time, John stepped forward, gripping the podium with both hands. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him, their expressions filled with curiosity and respect. For a moment, he froze, overwhelmed by the weight of their attention. But then he took a deep breath, looked out at the sea of faces, and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," he started, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "A few months ago, I never would have imagined standing here like this, in front of so many people who care enough to honor those who served. Honestly, I wasn't sure anyone remembered me or my fellow veterans anymore." He paused, his gaze drifting momentarily to the scars on his hands before continuing. "I spent years thinking I didn't belong anywhere. That after everything I went through, no one wanted to hear about it, or even see me. But I was wrong. This community proved that to me in ways I'll never forget. John went on to recount his journey, the battles overseas, the struggles back home, and the day he found himself in Judge Hayes' courtroom. His voice cracked at times, especially when he thanked her and others who had reached out to help him rebuild his life. "It's not just about me," he emphasized. "There are so many veterans out there who feel invisible, who think they don't matter anymore. But we do matter. And if my story can remind even one person of that, then maybe it means something." The crowd erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet once again. Tears glistened in the eyes of veterans seated in the front row, while families hugged each other tightly. Daniel Hayes, sitting beside his sister, wiped away a tear and mouthed the words, "Thank you" to John, who nodded in acknowledgement. After the ceremony, dozens of people approached John to shake his hand or share their own stories. A young boy handed him a drawing of a soldier saluting an American flag, saying, "This is you, sir. You're my hero." John knelt down to meet the child's eye level, smiling as he accepted the picture. "Thank you, buddy," he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. "That means the world to me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the park, John walked slowly back to his apartment. The streets were quiet now, the festivities winding down. Yet he couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, not defined by his past mistakes or hardships, but by the hope of what lay ahead. Inside his cozy apartment, he placed the boy's drawing on the refrigerator alongside other mementos, photos of him with new friends, notes of encouragement from strangers, and a calendar marked with upcoming counseling sessions and work shifts. Life wouldn't always be easy. He knew that much, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. The scars of war still lingered, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he'd come, and how much further he could go. That night, as John drifted off to sleep, he thought about the courtroom, the standing ovation, and the countless acts of kindness that had brought him here. He realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding beauty in the broken pieces and letting others help you put them back together. And for John Carter, that journey had only just begun.